On a cold afternoon at a forgotten roadside diner, a little girl in a faded pink raincoat crossed the room, gripped the leather vest of the most dangerous-looking man in the building, and whispered 7 words that neither of them would ever forget. She wasn't looking for a hero. She was looking for someone scary enough to make a very bad man back down. What she didn't know, and what nobody in that diner knew, was that the moment she chose Ryder Cole, a Hell's Angel with a skull patch and a past full of silence, she didn't just find protection. She handed a broken man the one thing he didn't know he was still looking for. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The cold had a particular kind of meanness to it that day. Not the sharp, clean cold of deep winter, but the damp, gray kind that settled into your bones and made everything feel heavier than it was. The kind of cold that turned a roadside diner into the most comforting building in a 20-mile stretch of flat Midwestern highway. From the outside, Patty's all-day diner looked like every other forgotten stop between somewhere and nowhere. A hand-painted sign, fogged windows, a parking lot with more gravel than pavement. But inside, the heat from the griddle and the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee made it feel almost like safety. Almost. Ryder Cole sat alone in a red vinyl booth near the back wall, his large frame taking up more space than most people would dare occupy. He was a big man, not just tall, but wide, built like someone who had spent decades doing hard things with his hands. His beard was thick and dark with threads of gray running through it, and his leather vest was worn soft at the edges, the kind of soft that comes from years of road miles, not from any store. On the back of that vest was a patch that most people in this part of the country recognized, even if they'd never seen one up close. The Hell's Angel's death's head stared outward from the leather like a warning that nobody asked for, but everybody understood. He was working through a plate of eggs and bacon with the focused indifference of a man who ate alone often enough that it no longer bothered him. A mug of black coffee sat at his right hand. He hadn't looked up since he sat down. The other people in the diner, 2 truckers at the counter, an older couple in the booth by the door, a pair of road workers on stools, were doing what people always did around Ryder Cole. They were pretending he wasn't there. Not rudely, not obviously. They just arranged their attention very carefully to exclude the booth in the back corner, the way you learn to look around a scar on someone's face after you've been around them long enough. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Trina who'd been working this stretch of highway for 20 years, refilled his coffee without making eye contact. She learned a long time ago that the ones who looked like trouble usually just wanted to eat in peace. It was the polite ones who gave her problems. Ryder didn't mind any of it. The silence suited him. He'd spent enough of his life navigating noise. The noise of the road, the noise of the club, the noise of everything he was still carrying from 15 years ago that he hadn't figured out how to put down. Silence was a luxury, and he intended to enjoy it with his eggs. That's when he noticed her. Across the diner, near the window that faced the parking lot, a small girl sat alone at a 2-person table. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She was wearing a pink raincoat that had been washed so many times the color had gone pale and uneven, and she had a backpack on her lap that she was holding with both arms wrapped around it, like she was afraid someone might take it. Her eyes were dark and serious, and she was watching the front door with the kind of attention you didn't usually see in a child that age. Not restless watching, not bored watching, careful watching. Ryder noticed these things because after the life he'd lived, he noticed everything. And what he noticed about this girl made something shift in the back of his chest in a way he couldn't quite name. She was alone. She was scared, and she was hiding it. He looked away and picked up his fork. Not his problem. Then he saw the man outside. Through the fog glass of the diner window, a figure was moving back and forth on the sidewalk. Tall, sharply dressed in a tan trench coat that looked wrong for the weather, too neat, too deliberate. The man had a narrow face and the kind of stillness in his posture that didn't come from calm. It came from control. He wasn't pacing the way someone paces when they're cold or restless. He was pacing the way someone paces when they're deciding something. Every few seconds, he looked through the glass directly at the girl. The look wasn't frantic. It wasn't worried. It was patient and exact, the way a man looks at something he already considers his. Ryder set his fork down. He watched the man outside for about 45 seconds, long enough to understand the geometry of what was happening, long enough to see the girl flinch slightly every time those eyes found her through the glass, long enough to know this wasn't a father looking for a lost kid. Something about the whole picture was wrong in a way that Ryder's gut recognized before his brain fully processed it. The man outside, Victor Hale, though Ryder didn't know his name yet, made his decision. He straightened his coat, pushed open the diner door, and stepped inside. The bell above the door rang once. Victor didn't come straight to the girl. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he stopped at the counter, flagged Trina down with a practiced smile, and began speaking to her in a low voice. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a photograph, sliding it across the counter toward her. He pointed toward the back of the diner, toward the girl. The girl, Amara, though Ryder still didn't know that either, felt it happening before she saw it. Maybe it was some instinct that had been sharpened by however she'd ended up alone in this diner. Her breathing shifted. Her shoulders went rigid. Her arms tightened around that backpack. And then she looked at Ryder. He didn't know why she picked him. Later, he would think about that moment many times. There were other people in the diner, the truckers, the old couple, the road workers. She could have walked to any of them. But she looked at the skull on the back of his vest, and whatever calculation she ran in her 8-year-old mind pointed her toward the biggest, most intimidating man in the room. She slid off her chair quietly. Her small sneakers made tiny squeaking sounds on the black and white checkered floor as she crossed the diner. Each step was deliberate, like she was choosing them carefully. She didn't run. Running would draw attention. Ryder watched her come without moving, without expression, unsure what he was about to say when she reached him. She reached up and gripped the edge of his leather vest with one small hand, and she whispered, "Please pretend you're my dad." Her voice barely made a sound. It was controlled in a way that broke something open in his chest. This tiny person who was clearly terrified had still managed to keep her voice from shaking. Not quite. There was still a tremor in it. But she'd fought it down. She was fighting everything down. Ryder's first instinct was to assume he'd misheard. His second instinct was to assume it was some kind of game, maybe a dare from kids outside, or a setup for something. He looked around the diner, half expecting to see a parent somewhere watching with amusement. But then he looked at her hands. The knuckles of her small fingers around his vest were pale with pressure. She wasn't playing a game, and she still hadn't looked back at the man behind her, which Ryder understood immediately. She knew better than to look back, because looking back meant giving herself away. She had thought this through. He made his decision in about 2 seconds. He reached out, placed one hand on her shoulder, gently, carefully, the way you'd handle something fragile, and guided her into the booth seat beside him. She slid in without hesitation, pressing herself close to the inside of the booth, putting as much of him between herself and the rest of the diner as possible. Victor had finished his conversation with Trina and was now walking slowly toward the back of the diner. His expression was pleasant, professionally pleasant, the kind of pleasant you practice in a mirror. He stopped at the edge of Ryder's booth, looked down at the girl, then up at Ryder with a calm, inquiring smile. "Excuse me," Victor said. His voice was smooth, reasonable. "Have you happened to see this young lady come in? We got separated in the parking lot. I'm her guardian." The whole diner was listening. Ryder could feel it, that particular quiet that falls over a room when everyone stops pretending not to hear. He looked at Victor for a moment. He read the suit, the practiced smile, the way the man's eyes kept dropping to the backpack in Amara's arms. He looked at the photograph still in Victor's hand. It was Amara, no question, but that didn't tell him anything about who had the right to her. Ryder put his arm around Amara's shoulders. Not aggressively, just firmly. "That's my kid," he said. The words came out of nowhere and everywhere at the same time. He hadn't decided to say them. They were just there, fully formed, and they came out in his voice, which was low and flat, and carried the kind of weight that came from being a large man who rarely needed to raise it. The diner got quieter. Victor's pleasant expression didn't break, but something behind it shifted. His gaze moved slowly across Ryder's vest, the patches, the chapter tab, the road name. He was doing math, calculating what walking this back would cost versus what pressing it might get him. A smart man, which made him more dangerous than a stupid one. The moment stretched. Then Victor smiled again, smaller this time. He tucked the photograph back into his coat pocket with unhurried hands. "My mistake," he said quietly. He held Ryder's eyes for one more second, just long enough to make sure the message landed. And then he said, soft enough that only Ryder could hear it clearly, "We'll talk again." It wasn't a threat exactly. It was something colder than a threat, a statement of certainty. Then he turned and walked back toward the entrance. The bell above the door rang. He was gone. The diner exhaled around them. The truckers went back to their coffee. Trina disappeared behind the counter. The old couple resumed whatever they'd been discussing. The room came back to itself like nothing had happened. Ryder looked down at the girl beside him. She hadn't relaxed. Her arms were still tight around the backpack. She was watching the window where Victor could still be seen outside, moving to a dark sedan parked across the street. Her jaw was set with the kind of tension that belonged on a grown adult. "He's not supposed to find me," she said quietly. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. She said it the way you say a fact, like she was reporting the weather. Ryder looked at his plate of eggs, now cold. He looked back out the window. Victor had gotten into the sedan, but hadn't driven away. He was sitting in it, still, which was somehow worse. Whatever he'd walked into, it wasn't small. He could feel that much. The sedan stayed parked across the street for a long time. Long enough that Ryder ordered another cup of coffee just to have something to do with his hands while he thought. He waited until Trina brought it and moved away before he looked down at the girl. "All right," he said, keeping his voice low. "Talk to me." Amara didn't answer right away. She watched the window for another few seconds, then seemed to make some internal calculation and shifted her attention to him. Up close, her eyes were older than her face. Not in a damaged way, in a careful way, like someone who had learned to observe everything and trust slowly. "There was a car," she said, "at a gas station, 2 towns over. I was in the back seat." "Whose car?" She hesitated. "Man, I didn't know. My mom put me with them. She said they would take me somewhere safe." She pressed her lips together for a second, but then they stopped for gas, and I heard them talking. Through the window. Ryder waited. They said something about papers and a transfer. Like I was... She paused, looking for the word. Like I was something being moved. The way she said it, matter of fact, but with a thread of something underneath it, pulled at him. She was 8 years old. She shouldn't have known what it meant for a person to sound like a package being shipped. But she had known. She had heard it, and she had understood it, and she had gotten out of that car. "So you ran," he said. "I walked into the gas station bathroom, and I went out the back," she said. "Then I walked to the road, and I kept going until I found the diner." Ryder looked at her small sneakers. They were damp around the edges, the laces darkened by mud. She'd walked some distance. "Where's your mother?" he asked. Something moved through her expression. There and gone, like a cloud shadow crossing a field. She said if anything happened, if she couldn't be there, I should find someone with a winged skull patch. She glanced at his vest. She made me memorize what it looked like. The words landed oddly. He stared at her for a moment. "She told you specifically to look for the skull with the wings," Amara said. She pointed at his chest, at the emblem on his patch. "Like that." Ryder sat back. The Hell's Angel's death's head. His mother had told her to find someone wearing that specific patch. "I don't know your family," he said carefully. "I want you to understand that. Whatever your mother told you, I'm not sure she and I ever met." "Her name is Danielle," Amara said. "Danielle Brooks." The name hit him somewhere just below the breastbone. He didn't show it on his face. He'd spent enough years keeping his face neutral that the reflex was automatic. But inside, something went very still. Danielle Brooks. He hadn't heard that name in years. But he knew it. He knew it because Danielle had been the woman his younger brother Marcus was with before everything fell apart. Before the arrest. Before the years of prison that Marcus never made it out of. Ryder looked at the girl beside him. He looked at her face, really looked at it, the way he had been avoiding doing since she sat down. He thought about Marcus. He thought about how long ago all of that was. "How old are you?" he asked, though it came out more quietly than he intended. 8, she said. 9 in April. He looked away, did the math without meaning to, felt the math settle in his chest in an uncomfortable way, like a stone that wasn't going anywhere. He didn't say anything about that. Not now. Maybe not ever. He filed it somewhere in the back of his mind and turned his attention to what was immediately in front of him. "Your mother," he said. "Where's she right now?" Amara's fingers tightened slightly on her backpack straps. "She said she had to go somewhere important. She said she would find me after, that the people in the car would keep me safe until she did." Her chin lifted slightly. "But they weren't keeping me safe." "No," Ryder agreed. "They weren't." He looked out the window again. Victor's sedan was still there, still parked, still watching. He pulled out his phone, turned it slightly away from the window on instinct, and thought about his options. Calling the police was the obvious play. Turn the kid over, step out of whatever this was, go back to his life. Clean. Simple. Except there was a federal-looking man sitting in a car across the street who had produced what looked like legal paperwork in under 5 minutes and had somehow known exactly which diner this girl was in, which meant either he'd been following her since that gas station or someone in whatever official network he was connected to had fed him the information quickly. Either way, involving local cops meant involving a system that might already have channels running through it that Ryder didn't understand and couldn't trust. He looked at the backpack. "What's in there?" he asked. "You've been holding it like your life depends on it." Amara looked down at the backpack. She seemed to debate something with herself, then reached into a side pocket, not the main compartment, the small inner pocket that most people wouldn't notice, and carefully peeled back a section of the lining. Tucked against the interior fabric, barely visible, was a small flat object about the size of a thumbnail. A USB flash drive. "My mom put it there," Amara said. "She said it was insurance. She said if anything happened, it was important." Ryder looked at the drive without touching it. "You know what's on it?" "No," Amara said. "She just said it was important. She said I should protect it and not give it to anyone I didn't trust completely." He sat with that for a moment. Insurance. A private investigator with legal paperwork already prepared. A girl being transferred somewhere by men who talked about her like cargo. These pieces weren't adding up to anything small. He pulled out his phone and called Big Cal. Calvin Briggs, Big Cal to everyone who knew him, was the chapter president, and he answered on the third ring with the bored patience he extended to almost everything. Ryder kept his voice low and quick. He didn't explain the whole situation. He explained enough that he had a kid connected to his brother's history, that she needed somewhere to be for the night, and that there was a man watching from across the street who had resources and didn't look like he was going away. Big Cal was quiet for a moment. "Then who's the man?" "Don't know his name yet. Sharp dresser, government adjacent. Produced guardianship papers fast." Another pause. "Ryder." Cal's voice shifted. "The name Victor Hale mean anything to you?" Ryder looked out the window at the sedan. "Should it? If the man outside is Victor Hale, he works private contractor. But his clients aren't private. We've heard his name connected to federal cleanup work. The kind where inconvenient people stop being inconvenient." Cal's tone was careful. "Even. You're talking about heat, Ryder. The kind that doesn't stay on one person." "I know what I'm talking about." "The girl," Cal said. "She actually connected to Marcus? Her mother is Danielle Brooks." The line was quiet for 5 full seconds. Cal had known Marcus. He'd known all of it. "Get here," Cal said finally. "But you better know what you're carrying." He ended the call. Ryder looked at Amara, who was watching him with her careful, patient eyes. She hadn't asked what was being said. She was good at waiting. "We're going to go somewhere safer," he said. "My club has a property outside town. Nobody gets on that property without permission." "Is it safe?" she asked. "For tonight," he said. "Yes." She nodded once. She trusted that more easily than he expected, and for a half-second he wondered what it said about everything else she'd been through that a Hell's Angels compound sounded reasonable to her. He left cash on the table, more than enough, and kept himself between Amara and the window as they moved toward the back exit. He pushed the rear door open into the cold, gray afternoon, feeling the weight of the situation pressing against his shoulder blades like a hand. The compound was 40 minutes outside of town on a rural road that most GPS systems didn't know about. It sat back from the road on a few acres of land, garages, a main house, a fire pit, a fence that looked casual until you noticed how solid it actually was. When Ryder's truck came through the gate, several men looked up from their various tasks with the unhurried attention of people who had learned to read situations fast. Amara sat in the passenger seat and looked at everything through the window with her backpack in her lap, not visibly scared but visibly cataloging, taking stock, deciding what she thought. An older man detached himself from a group near one of the garages and walked over as Ryder climbed out. He was heavy-set, gray-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and an ease in his stride that didn't match the setting. This was Doc, Gerald Moorfield to the state of Missouri, but Doc to everyone for the last 20 years. He had been an Army communications specialist before circumstances took him in a different direction, and he still moved with the precise, unhurried competence of someone who understood systems and how to work them. He looked at the girl as she climbed down from the truck. "Well," he said, not unkindly. "Her name's Amara," Ryder said. "She has a flash drive with encrypted files. And there's a man named Victor Hale who may be making moves before morning." Doc looked at the drive when Amara held it out, then at Ryder. "You want me to get into it?" "If you can." "I can," Doc said simply. Inside, Amara sat at a table in the main room and ate a plate of toast that Doc made without asking her if she wanted anything. He just made it and put it down in front of her, which seemed to be the right call because she ate all of it. Around her, the compound continued its evening business. Men moved in and out. Nobody crowded her, mostly because Ryder was nearby and nobody needed the look he would give them if they made the girl uncomfortable. Doc connected the drive to a laptop he'd hardened himself years ago, screen tilted away from the general room, and started working. Ryder sat across from him and waited. It took about 20 minutes. When Doc leaned back and adjusted his glasses, his expression had shifted into something quieter, more serious. "The files are financial records," he said, keeping his voice low. "Not personal finances. Corporate. A shell company. Looks like it's been routing money through multiple nonprofit structures." He turned the laptop slowly. "The name on the foundational documents is something called Bright Futures Placement Group, but the real money is moving through a network of foster care transfer contracts." He paused. "There are names in here, Ryder. Names tied to these transfers. Kids moved across state lines under emergency placement clauses with almost no oversight documentation." Ryder stared at the screen. "Danielle Brooks," Doc continued, "is listed as an internal auditor for one of the nonprofits in the network. Not listed prominently, but her signature is on several anomaly reports that were apparently filed and ignored." He looked up. She wasn't running from something random. She found this. She put it together, and then she ran because of what she found. Across the room, Amara had finished her toast and was sitting quietly with her backpack in her lap again. She couldn't hear them, but she was watching them the way she'd watched everything all evening, carefully, reading what she could from the distance. Her mother hadn't been fleeing danger. Her mother had been carrying proof. And Victor Hale hadn't been looking for a lost child. He'd been sent to retrieve a witness and eliminate the evidence she'd put in motion, which meant Amara wasn't just caught in something. She was the most important loose end in it. Before Ryder could fully process what that meant, one of the men by the gate came inside with a look on his face that didn't need words. "News van out on the highway," he said, "and there's a ticker running. Amber Alert. Boykirgong suspected abduction." The room shifted. Ryder looked at the screen, then at Amara, then at the gate. Victor Hale hadn't waited until morning. In the back of the room, Amara had already heard the word Amber Alert. She had already understood what it meant, and she was already quietly gathering her backpack, pulling the straps over her shoulders, standing up with the careful, controlled movements of a girl who had been calculating exits since she was old enough to understand she might need one. Ryder was across the room before she had taken a step. "Stop," he said. She stopped. She looked up at him. "You're not doing that," he said. "I'm making trouble for everyone here," she said quietly. "If I go, it stops." "You're 8 years old," he said. "You're not making any decisions tonight." "He'll keep coming," she said. "And now everyone here is in trouble because of me." He crouched down so he was closer to her level. Not all the way. He was too big to get all the way down easily, but enough that the angle between them wasn't as steep. "Listen," he said, his voice as plain as he could make it. "Your mother knew what that drive meant. She knew who to send you to. She prepared you better than most grown people I've known." He paused. "She didn't do all of that, so you could walk back out into the dark by yourself. You understand me." Amara looked at him for a long moment with those careful dark eyes. "You don't get to run alone anymore," he said. "Not tonight." Something in her face shifted. Barely. The way ice shifts when it's starting to give. You can't quite see it move, but you can feel that something has changed. She sat back down. Outside, somewhere on the distant highway, the red and blue flicker of police lights came and went through the trees like something that had been moving toward them for a while and had finally decided to arrive. The police lights on the distant highway faded before they got close. A patrol car passing through rather than turning toward the compound's gravel road. But nobody inside relaxed much. The Amber Alert was out there now, moving through every scanner and dashboard screen in the county, and it had Ryder's description on it. Big man, leather vest, Hell's Angels patches, traveling with a young black girl. Considered dangerous. The fact that the description fit him perfectly was either impressive efficiency or proof that Victor Hale had done this before. Ryder stood at the front window for a long moment after the lights disappeared, then turned back to the room. Several of the other members were gathered near the back wall. 4 men in total, arms crossed, expressions ranging from worried to quietly hostile. Nobody was yelling. That wasn't how this club operated. But the air had the kind of pressure in it that meant questions were coming. Big Cal arrived from the back hallway before the questions started. He was a large man, broader than Ryder even, with a shaved head and a short silver beard and the specific patience of someone who had spent decades making hard decisions and living with them. He looked at Amara first. She was still seated at the table with her backpack, watching him the same way she watched everything, steadily, giving nothing away. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked at Ryder. "Talk," he said. Ryder told him. Not everything. Not the part about Marcus. Not the math he'd been quietly doing in the back of his mind all evening. But the rest of it. The diner. Victor's appearance. The Amber Alert. The flash drive, and what Doc had found on it. Cal listened without interrupting. When Ryder finished, Cal was quiet for a moment. "Doc," he said, "how solid is what's on that drive?" Doc had the laptop open on the table, the screen angled toward Cal now. "Solid enough that someone paid to get it back," he said. "The financial structures are layered, but not that clever. Shelton nonprofit to placement contract. The money moves on paper like charitable funding and comes out the other side as contractor payments. The contractors are placement agencies. The agencies are moving kids." He paused. The anomaly reports Danielle filed go back 14 months. She wasn't guessing. She was documenting. Cal looked at the screen for a long moment. Names. Corporate names. The individual at the top isn't named in what I've opened so far. There's a second encryption layer on the deeper files. "I need more time." Cal nodded once, then straightened up and looked at the men along the back wall. "We're not discussing whether to help," he said plainly. "We're discussing how to do it carefully. Anybody who has a problem with that can take the night off property." He looked at them each in turn. Nobody moved. He nodded again. "Then get back to what you were doing." The room eased slightly. Not because the problem had gotten smaller. It hadn't, but because Cal had pointed a direction, and this club had always moved better with a direction than without one. Ryder pulled a chair over to Doc's table and sat down. Across the room, one of the younger members, a quiet, steady man named Preston, had moved over to sit near Amara without making it obvious that was what he was doing. He set a deck of cards on the table between them without a word. Amara looked at the cards, then at him, then picked up the deck and began shuffling it with practiced hands, which clearly surprised him. She dealt without asking, and he picked up his hand with the careful expression of a man who had just realized he might lose. It helped. The tension in her shoulders came down a fraction. Ryder watched it, then turned back to the laptop. Doc had been working at the second encryption layer with steady, methodical patience. He wasn't rushing it. You didn't rush this kind of work. He told Ryder once that the Army had taught him 2 things that stuck: how to be patient and how to pay attention to what something was trying to protect rather than just what it was. The harder the lock, the more important what's behind it. 20 minutes passed. Preston lost 3 hands of cards to an 8-year-old and accepted this without complaint. Then Doc sat back slightly. "There it is," he said quietly. Ryder leaned in. The second layer of files was different from the first. The first had been financial architecture, numbers, dates, transfer codes, account routing. Clean, but complex. This layer was messy, eh? It had the look of something assembled in a hurry by someone who knew exactly what they were documenting, but wasn't sure how much time they had. There were scanned documents, photographs of physical paperwork, and a series of internal memos with institutional letterhead at the top. The letterhead read, Bright Futures Placement Group, Regional Oversight Division. And below the memos, attached as a separate folder, were placement records, children's names, ages, case numbers, transfer authorizations stamped with expedited emergency clause approvals. Most of the records had final placement destinations listed, foster families, group homes, transitional facilities. But a significant number of them stopped mid-process. Transfer authorized. Transfer executed. No final placement recorded. No record of where those children had gone. How many? Ryder said. Doc counted quietly, moving through the folder. 47 cases across a 3-year period. No final placement documentation. He looked up. That's not administrative error. That's deliberate. The room felt different after that. Heavier. Ryder thought about Victor Hale, sitting in his sedan outside the diner. He thought about the careful, patient way the man had looked through the glass at Amara. Not like a guardian looking for a lost child. Like someone inventorying what he'd come to collect. He thought about the words Amara had overheard at the gas station. Papers. Transfer. Danielle Brooks had figured this out from the inside. She documented it, encrypted it, sewn it into her daughter's backpack, and told that daughter to find someone with a skull and wings. Because she had known this was serious enough that she might not be able to protect Amara herself. And she had known that the kind of person who scared off the people running this operation was not the kind of person who wore a badge. We need to get this to someone outside the local system, Ryder said. Someone who isn't connected to whatever this is. I have a contact, Doc said, without looking up from the screen. Investigative journalist. She's legitimate, national outlet. She's covered federal corruption before, and she's careful about sources. You trust her? I trust that she wants the story more than she wants to protect the people in it, Doc said. For this situation, that's the kind of trust that matters. Ryder thought about it for a moment, then nodded. Do it, but keep it clean. Don't give her anything that points back here until we know the situation with the girl is resolved. Doc began copying the files. In the back of the room, Amara had won another hand and was now dealing the next round with the small private satisfaction of someone who had found something ordinary to hold on to in the middle of something terrifying. Preston glanced over at Ryder with an expression that said he wasn't entirely sure how this had happened to him, but he wasn't complaining. Then, from somewhere beyond the far wall of the main room, voices rose briefly. 2 men arguing in the narrow hallway between the garage and the side entrance, not bothering to keep it down. Words carried through the thin wall. Federal raid. Heat on the whole chapter. Never should have brought her here. Ryder heard it. Doc heard it. Preston heard it. Amara heard it too. Her hands stopped moving over the cards. She set them down carefully on the table in front of her. Her face was still controlled, still that practiced stillness, but her eyes went somewhere far away for just a moment, the look of a child recalculating. Preston noticed and said something quietly to her, pointing at the cards, trying to keep the game going. She looked at him. Then she looked at Ryder. Then, slowly and with great care, she began gathering her things. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicked. She was moving with the same methodical quiet she'd used getting out of that gas station bathroom. She was being sensible. She was doing the math on what she was costing people and deciding to remove herself from the equation. Ryder was on his feet before she got the first strap over her shoulder. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and she looked up at him with her backpack half on and her chin set and her eyes dry. I heard them, she said simply. I'm making trouble. You heard 2 people venting, he said. That's different from the club's position. I don't want anyone here to get raided because of me. That's not your decision to make, he said. And it's not happening tonight. She looked at him steadily. You don't know that. No, he agreed. But you don't either. And you're not walking out that gate because you're trying to protect people you just met. He met her eyes and kept his voice level. That's not how this works. You don't get to run alone anymore. Something in her face changed then. Not dramatically, but the set of her chin shifted slightly and her grip on the backpack strap loosened by a degree. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, careful eyes, reading him the way she'd been reading everything all night. Then she slid the strap back off her shoulder and sat back down. Preston quietly collected the cards and dealt the next hand without comment. Ryder returned to Doc's table and sat down heavily. Through the window, the night outside was full and dark and still. Somewhere out on the distant highway, headlights moved east. Somewhere beyond that, Victor Hale was making calls and the Amber Alert was spreading, and the machinery of whatever operation Danielle had documented was turning its attention toward a rural compound on an unmarked road. But the files were transmitting, and for tonight that was enough. They came before dawn, while the sky was still that dark gray that isn't quite night and isn't quite morning, the hour when everything feels most uncertain. Ryder woke to a hand on his shoulder. Preston crouched beside the cot in the back room where Ryder had settled for a few hours, keeping his voice just above a whisper. Vehicles on the perimeter road. State plates. 8 units at least. Ryder was on his feet in one motion. The compound shifted awake around him with the particular efficiency of people who had long since built emergency response into their muscle memory. No shouting. Lights came on in sequence. Men moved to their positions along the fence line. Not with weapons drawn, but with the deliberate, visible calm of a group that understood the difference between readiness and provocation. Big Cal was already at the front gate with his arms crossed when Ryder came outside into the cold air. The first state police vehicle had its lights running, painting the gravel yard in alternating red and blue. More vehicles behind it fanned out across the approach road in a pattern that was serious but not yet urgent. A voice came through a loudspeaker, firm, procedural, announcing their intent and directing all persons on the property to present themselves at the gate. Amara was awake, standing in the doorway of the main house with Doc beside her, his hand resting on the doorframe in a way that was half blocking, half steadying. She was watching the lights with her arms wrapped around her backpack and her face doing the thing it did when she was working very hard to keep everything inside. Ryder looked at the vehicles. He looked at the fence. He looked at the men positioned along it, all of them watching him, waiting to see how he was going to play this. He made the decision the same way he'd made the decision in the diner. Fast, without overthinking it. Cal, he said. Cal looked at him. I'm walking out with her. Unarmed. Cal held his gaze for a moment. That puts you in cuffs. Probably. In her. They won't touch her as long as it's clean and visible, and I don't give them a reason. He paused. If we lock the gate and make this a standoff, everyone loses. If I walk out, it's controlled. The narrative stays smaller. Cal looked at the vehicles. He looked at Ryder. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Don't say anything without a lawyer. Ryder took off his jacket and handed it to Preston. He held both hands visible at his sides. Then he went to the door where Doc and Amara were standing, crouched down to her level, and looked at her directly. I need you to stay calm, he said. Whatever happens out there, whatever anyone says, I need you to stay calm and stay quiet. Can you do that? She looked at him for a moment. Are they going to take me? He didn't lie to her. There might be someone out there claiming authority over you, but nothing has been decided. You understand? Nothing is settled yet. Whatever they say, remember what you know. She nodded once, small and certain. He stood up, picked her up carefully so she was settled against his chest, and walked toward the gate with his hands visible and his pace steady and his expression as neutral as he could make it. Behind him, the compound was quiet. The men along the fence stood still, arms at their sides, presenting exactly the image he needed them to present, controlled, present, but non-threatening. The gate opened. He stepped through into the wash of floodlights and police headlights and the raw cold of the pre-dawn air. An officer came forward immediately, hand raised, directing him to stop. He stopped. He set Amara down slowly beside him, keeping one hand on her shoulder. Hands, the officer said. He put them up. Behind him, he could feel Amara pressing slightly against his leg, but she made no sound. The cuffs went on without incident. And then, from between two of the state police vehicles, Victor Hale appeared. He was dressed as neatly as he had been in the diner, coat pressed, expression composed, moving with the ease of a man who had arranged all of this and was now watching it complete. He nodded to a senior officer as he passed, with the familiarity of someone expected. He stopped a few feet from Amara and looked down at her with a practiced version of relief on his face, the expression of a guardian reuniting with a child he had been worried about. "There she is," he said warmly. Then, to the officer beside Ryder, "I appreciate this. It's been a very long night." Amara stared at him without blinking. Victor reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He handed it to the officer, but tilted it briefly so Ryder could see the heading. Legal Guardianship Authorization. Below that, a signature line. Ryder could read the name without difficulty. Danielle Brooks. The bottom dropped out of the moment. Ryder looked at the document. He looked at Amara, whose face had gone from controlled to something quieter and more terrible. The expression of a child confronting something her mind was resisting. "My mom didn't sign that," she said. Her voice was steady but barely. Victor looked at her with practiced sympathy. "Sweetheart, your mom made arrangements to keep you safe. These are her decisions." "She wouldn't," Amara said. "She was worried about you. She wanted you protected." Amara's jaw tightened. She looked up at Ryder. He looked back at her, and what he said quietly enough that only she could hear it clearly. "Trust what your mother told you, not what they show you." It wasn't much, but it was what he had. He watched something settle in her expression. Not comfort exactly, but something like anchor, a decision to hold on. Victor watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, then turned back to the senior officer with a smooth redirect. The officer was already moving toward Ryder, directing him toward a vehicle. The cuffs were still on. Ryder went without resistance. He didn't look back, but in the second before the vehicle door closed behind him, he heard Amara's voice, clear and deliberate, carrying across the cold air to no one in particular. "He didn't take me. I asked him." Nobody answered her, but she'd said it, into the record, into the air, into whatever anyone was listening with. The drive to the station took 20 minutes. The interrogation room was a standard county setup, fluorescent lights, metal table, plastic chairs, the specific smell of industrial cleaner and old coffee that these rooms always had. Ryder sat with his hands loose on the table and waited. The man who came in wasn't local. Ryder pegged him in the first 10 seconds. The way he carried himself, the quality of his shoes, the flat effect of someone trained to give nothing away while taking everything in. He introduced himself as Agent Connolly, liaison from a federal task force, and made the introduction sound routine. Ryder didn't answer questions about Amara. He asked for a lawyer and then sat quietly with his hands on the table. Connolly didn't push hard, which itself was information. He was circling, not pressing. He wanted something specific. "Mr. Cole," Connolly said after a long pause, "you understand that the Amber Alert was filed by a licensed guardian with court documentation. That makes your actions last night." "I asked for a lawyer," Ryder said. Connolly changed angles. "We're not interested in the biker angle here. We're interested in the child's situation. If you have concerns about how she came to be traveling alone." "Lawyer." Connolly sat back. He looked at the table for a moment, then at Ryder. "Danielle Brooks is listed as deceased," he said, and his tone shifted, still controlled, but watching Ryder now for something. "Car accident 2 weeks ago." "Did you know that?" Ryder kept his face still, but his insides went cold and very quiet. 2 weeks. Amara had been in that car for some amount of time after that, however long it took to go 2 towns over, which meant Amara didn't know. She'd been asking for her mother like Danielle was somewhere waiting, like the separation was temporary. She had talked about her mother in the present tense all night. She didn't know. He looked at the table and said nothing. Connolly watched him for another moment, then stood and gathered his folder with the unhurried movements of a man who had more time than the person across the table from him. He paused at the door. "You should think about what cooperation looks like, Mr. Cole. Things move faster that way." Then he left. Ryder sat alone in the fluorescent room and thought about a girl with a backpack holding both straps, watching a diner door. He thought about Danielle Brooks, who had spent 14 months documenting something terrible and had known it might kill her and had sewn evidence into her daughter's backpack and told that daughter to find a skull with wings. He thought about what a person had to believe about the world to trust an outlaw biker over the people running it. He understood it was the thing. He understood it completely. Down the hall, in a separate holding area, Amara was alone with Victor Hale. He had a form on the table in front of her. He had explained it twice now, that it was a voluntary transfer authorization, that it would allow him to complete the guardianship process, that her mother had already set things in motion, and this was simply the next step. Amara sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the form. She didn't touch it. Victor kept his voice gentle and patient, but she had been watching his face all morning the way she watched everything, and she had noticed things. He never mentioned her mother's funeral. When she had asked, quietly, carefully, whether her mother was okay, he had said her mother was being taken care of, which was not an answer. When she had asked where the guardianship papers would take her, he had said to a safe place, which was also not an answer. She noticed that he didn't look at the form when he slid it toward her. A person who believed in what they were doing usually looked at the thing they were asking you to sign. He looked at the door. "My mom said," Amara began, and Victor's expression shifted slightly, prepared. He'd heard this several times now. She said, "If someone shows you papers, ask who benefits." Victor studied her for a moment. Something changed in his face, small and quick there and gone. Not irritation. Something more complicated than that. "The papers benefit you," he said. "They establish your legal protection." "From who?" He didn't answer. She pulled her hands back from the table, closer to herself. "I'm not signing it," she said. It wasn't defiant. It was just a fact, stated in the same tone she used for everything. Victor sat back. The composed, professional surface was holding, but underneath it, she could see, with the particular sight of a child who had been paying attention to adult behavior her whole life, that it was being held deliberately. He was working to keep it there, which meant something was pressing on it from the other side. She filed that away, and she waited. Across town, in a small rented office above a dry cleaner on Mulberry Street, a journalist named Evelyn Shaw was on her third cup of coffee in her second hour with a folder of encrypted files that had arrived through a secure channel from a source who had identified themselves only as a friend of the evidence. She had been covering federal financial corruption for 11 years. She had seen shell corporations and laundering structures and nonprofit misuse in a dozen forms. But what she was looking at in these files was something she had to read twice, then a third time, before she let herself begin to understand what it was. The children's cases, the incomplete placement records, the pattern of transfer authorizations with no documented outcomes. She opened the second folder and found the memos, found the letterhead, found the signature on the oversight approval forms, a consistent signature appearing across 3 years of expedited emergency placements, authorizing transfers under a clause that bypassed the standard child welfare review process. The signature belonged to a state-level official. She recognized the name from press releases and campaign materials and a child protection reform initiative that had received significant media coverage the previous year. State Senator Malcolm Reeves. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her editor. The call lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, she was already building the document structure for what would become the first article. Careful, precisely sourced, framed around financial irregularities rather than individual accusations. You built the financial case first. You named names when the foundation was solid enough to hold the weight. It wasn't solid yet, but it was getting there. Outside the county police station, the early morning light was coming up gray and thin over the parking lot. In the back seat of Victor Hale's rented sedan, parked now, engine off, Victor sat alone making a call. The line rang twice. A voice answered that was clipped and unhurried and gave away nothing. Victor delivered his update. The flash drive had likely been copied before his team secured the physical drive. The journalist had been flagged. The girl was in custody, but was not cooperating with the transfer authorization. There was a pause on the other end. "Resolve it," the voice said. The call ended. Victor sat in the cold sedan and looked at the station entrance. He had been doing this kind of work for 11 years. He told himself at the start that it was about protecting children from broken systems. And for a long time, he had found ways to believe that. But somewhere in the last few years, the work had changed around him, or he had changed around it, And now he was sitting outside a police station trying to get an 8-year-old girl to sign a form that would move her to a location he wasn't entirely sure he'd been given accurate information about. He sat with that for a moment. Then he got out of the car and went back inside. The moment that broke the morning open didn't come from Victor or the federal liaison or Big Cal's lawyer, who arrived at the station at 7:15 and began the slow procedural work of establishing Ryder's position. It came from a laptop screen in Evelyn Shaw's rented office. She was cross-referencing the incomplete placement records against a public database of state-authorized foster placements when she found the gap that made everything else make sense. Not just missing final placements, missing children, case files that had been formally closed with completion codes that didn't match any receiving facility's intake records. She printed the comparison chart with shaking hands and stared at it. Then she opened a new document and began writing. By the time the courthouse was preparing Ryder's custody hearing, the first article was already with her editor. Not the big article. Not yet. Not without more verification. But a teaser. A careful, source piece about financial irregularities in foster transfer funding connected to a state-level office. No names yet. Just the shape of the thing. It published at 9:47 in the morning. By 10:15, Senator Malcolm Reeve's communications team had issued 3 memos internally and were preparing a public statement. By 10:30, the statement had been pulled because someone had figured out that responding to a story about financial irregularities by issuing a denial about foster care funding suggested you had specific reasons to feel implicated. The machine was moving. It was grinding and loud, and it had been running a long time without friction. But now something had gotten into the gears. And somewhere in a county police station, an 8-year-old girl sat in a plastic chair with her backpack in her lap, and her hands folded and refused, quietly, absolutely, without drama, to sign a single thing. Evelyn Shaw had a habit when she was working a story that mattered. She stopped drinking the coffee and started drinking water. Coffee was for the days when she was grinding through routine work, filing pieces about municipal budget meetings and zoning disputes and the slow administrative machinery of local government. Water was for the days when something real was in front of her and she needed her hands steady and her thinking clear. She had switched to water at 8:14 in the morning. By 9 o'clock, she had built a spreadsheet that mapped the financial flow from Bright Futures Placement Group outward through 7 connected nonprofit structures, each one a degree further from the source, each one progressively harder to connect back to the origin point. The money entered the system as charitable contributions from a foundation. It moved through grants and operational allocations and contractor payments, changing shape at each junction the way water changed shape moving through different vessels. By the time it reached the placement agencies, it looked like standard foster care funding. Clean, purposeful, the kind of thing that appeared in annual reports under feel-good headings about community investment and child welfare outcomes. But the foundation at the top of the structure, the source of the original charitable contributions, was chaired by State Senator Malcolm Reeves. Evelyn had covered Reeves before. Not extensively. He'd come up in background checks for pieces about child protection reform legislation, which he had championed loudly and visibly for the better part of 2 years. He was polished in the specific way of politicians who had studied how to be polished. Never too smooth, always with a trace of deliberate roughness to suggest authenticity. He gave speeches in church halls and community centers, not just press conferences. He talked about the failures of the foster system with the controlled emotion of a man who wanted you to believe he had personal investment in the problem. Looking at his signature across 3 years of expedited emergency placement authorizations, Evelyn thought about those speeches with a cold clarity that made her set her water glass down carefully and sit very still for a moment. The emergency placement clause he had used, the one that bypassed standard child welfare review, had been written in a state code 18 months ago as part of a bill Reeves himself had co-sponsored. He had built the loophole and then used it, repeatedly, across 47 cases that had no documented final placement. She made herself slow down. In 11 years of this work, she had learned that the moment when everything felt like it was connecting was also the most dangerous moment. The moment when a journalist's desire for the story to be true could start doing the work that evidence was supposed to do. She went back to the files. She checked every connection twice. She looked for the places where the chain broke, where the link she assumed was there turned out to be coincidence or incomplete documentation. The chain held. She was building the second section of the article when her phone rang. The number was blocked. She answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was male, older, speaking in a deliberate undertone. He identified himself as a current employee of the Regional Oversight Division of Bright Futures Placement Group. He had seen the first article, the cautious, unnamed one she had published that morning. He said he had documentation she didn't have yet. He said he wanted to talk. When? She said. Tonight. Outside. Not in your office. She wrote down the details he gave her. After the call ended, she sat for a moment with a notepad in front of her, reading what she had written. Then she picked up her phone again and called her editor. We're going to need more time on the big piece, she said. How much more time? Maybe not as much as I thought. At the county police station, the morning was grinding slowly through its procedural hours. Ryder's lawyer, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who Big Cal had used for club-related legal matters for 15 years, had arrived at 7:15 and immediately established a perimeter around her client that made Agent Connolly's casual interrogation approach significantly less casual. Patricia had reviewed the Amber Alert filing, the guardianship documentation, and the timeline of events that had led to Ryder's custody, and had expressed her conclusions about each of them in terms that were technically courteous and substantively devastating. Ryder sat in the consultation room across from Patricia and told her everything, including the flash drive, including what Doc had found, including Danielle Brooks and his brother Marcus, and the math he had been quietly not doing for 2 days. Patricia listened without expression, which was something she had perfected in a career full of clients who told her things in consultation rooms that required her to receive calmly. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The guardianship documentation, she said. You believe it's falsified? I believe Danielle Brooks is listed as dead, he said, which makes it difficult for her to have signed paperwork authorizing someone else's custody of her daughter. Patricia looked at her notes. And the girl? She's been in a room with Victor Hale since this morning. She hasn't signed anything. I know that because I know how she thinks. Patricia looked up. You've known this child for approximately 36 hours. Yes. She studied him for a moment, the way she studied everything, measuring, calculating, deciding what was useful. Then she nodded once and began writing. I'm going to request a formal delay on any transfer authorization pending verification of the signatory's legal status. If Danielle Brooks is officially deceased, the paperwork is void on its face. She paused. That buys time. Not much, but some. In the hallway outside, the station was running its normal daytime business. Officers moving through, phones ringing, the ordinary noise of a building full of people managing situations. Nobody paid particular attention to the room at the far end of the hall, where Victor Hale sat across from an 8-year-old girl and a plastic table with an unsigned form on it. Amara had been in that room for hours. She had been offered water twice and a sandwich once. She had accepted the water. She sat with the same composure she had maintained through the diner and the compound and the pre-dawn lights in the gravel yard. That careful stillness that was not the stillness of a defeated person, but of someone who had decided to use patience as a strategy. She was watching Victor. She had been watching him the whole morning, the way you watch something you need to understand. He was good at this, better than most adults she had encountered in situations where adults were trying to manage her. He kept his voice calm. He kept his expressions appropriate. He produced his practiced sympathy and his practiced patience on cue. He was doing everything right, but she had noticed 3 things. The first was that he had never once mentioned her mother's funeral. Not when she asked where her mother was, not when she said her mother wouldn't have signed papers like this, not even when she said she wanted to see her mother. A person who believed what they were telling her would have had an answer for that. He redirected every time. The second was the way he looked at his phone. Every 40 minutes or so, he checked it with the specific expression of someone waiting for a message that hadn't come yet. He wasn't in charge of this situation. He was reporting to someone. The third was the form itself. She had looked at it carefully, read every line she could understand, and noticed that the destination field, the place she was supposedly being transferred to for her safety, listed a facility name but no street address. No city, just a name and a case number. Bright Futures Transitional Care, Unit 7. She had filed all three things away and said nothing about any of them. Victor tried a different approach in the early afternoon. He sat back from the table slightly, adopting a more relaxed posture, and changed his tone from guardian formal to something warmer. "I know this is scary," he said. "I know you don't know me. That's okay. You don't have to trust me right away." Amara waited. "But the people who are trying to help you, they're worried. And the longer this takes, the more complicated your situation gets." He paused. "Your mom set this up because she wanted you protected. That's all this is." Amara looked at the form. Then she looked at him. "My mom said if someone shows you papers, ask who benefits." Victor's expression held, but the muscle just below his right eye moved slightly, a tiny contraction there and gone. "The papers benefit you," he said. "They establish." "You said that before," she said. "You've said it 4 times. She folded her hands in her lap. "Who benefits besides me?" The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long. 2 seconds wasn't very long, but it was long enough for Amara, who was good at reading silences. Victor's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it quickly, then looked back at her with his expression restored. But she had already seen his face in the half-second before he controlled it. There had been something there. Not fear exactly. Something closer to a person recalibrating under pressure. He excused himself and stepped into the hallway. She watched the door close behind him. Then she turned to the room's one small window, high on the wall, which showed a strip of gray afternoon sky. She thought about what Ryder had said. Trust what your mother told you, not what they show you. She thought about what her mother had told her. All of it. Not just the instructions about the patch and the flash drive and the questions to ask, but the smaller things. The way her mother used to sit at the kitchen table late at night with files spread across it, the light low, her face concentrated and unafraid. The way she had explained to Amara once that some jobs weren't jobs, they were choices. That if you saw something wrong and had the ability to document it, walking away was its own kind of action. A choice you'd live with. She had been 8 when her mother said that. She had half understood it. She understood it completely now. In the hallway, Victor Hale pressed his phone to his ear and listened. The voice on the other end was Senator Reeves. Not his aide, not his communications director. Reeves himself, which meant the situation had elevated past the point where intermediaries were acceptable. Evelyn's first article had triggered a response from the senator's office. A scrambled, pulled-back response, but a response nonetheless. Which meant the story was on Reeves' radar. Which meant Victor's timeline had collapsed. "The journalist has more than we thought," Reeves said. "I need this finalized today." Victor looked down the hallway at the closed door. "She's 8 years old," he said. "She's a liability with a name attached to documentation that connects to my office. Get done." The call ended. Victor stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone at his side. He had been in this business long enough to have been in rooms like this before. The room where the thing you were doing became fully visible to you for the first time. Not because you hadn't known what it was, but because knowing and seeing were different things, and sometimes the difference between them took years to close. He thought about the 47 cases, the incomplete placement records, the children whose files closed with no documented outcome. He thought about a girl who had walked across a diner floor to a man she had never met because her mother had prepared her to know exactly what kind of help to look for. He put his phone back in his pocket and stood in the hallway for another long moment, doing the kind of thinking that felt like the last chance to do it. The meeting Evelyn had arranged happened that evening in the parking lot of a hardware store 3 miles from her office. The man who had called her was named Douglas Pratt. He was mid-50s, heavy-set, with the look of someone who had spent decades in administrative roles and had recently stopped sleeping well. He had a manila envelope under his arm when he got out of his car, and he handed it to her without preamble before they'd exchanged more than 10 words. Inside the envelope was a collection of internal memos from the Bright Futures Regional Oversight Division, the kind of memos that were never meant to leave the building. Progress reports, transfer completion confirmations, and a single document that Evelyn unfolded and read twice before she looked up. It was a communications log, dated 18 months back, a back and forth between a foundation operations manager and a state office staffer. The state office staffer's email signature showed a domain registered to the office of State Senator Malcolm Reeves. The communications log discussed expedited placement authorizations in language that was deliberately vague, coded phrases like case acceleration and situational transfers and resolution protocols, but cross-referenced against the case files Evelyn already had. The meaning of those phrases became clear. "How long have you had this?" she asked. Douglas pressed his mouth together. "Long enough that not coming forward makes me part of it." She looked back at the document. "Is there more?" He reached into the envelope and produced a thumb drive. "Everything I could pull without triggering the system audit. I had about 6 minutes." She took the drive. "Why now?" Douglas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the hardware store's lit sign across the parking lot. "My daughter works in child welfare placement," he said. "Different county, different agency. She called me last week about a case that looked wrong to her. The paperwork was right. The authorizations were right. The destination didn't match the documentation." He paused. "She called an anomaly. I'd seen 47 of them." He got back in his car without saying anything else. Evelyn drove back to her office with the thumb drive in her jacket pocket and her mind working very fast. Back at her desk, she connected the drive and began going through what Douglas had given her. It was dense, 4 years of internal communications and transfer logs, and she worked with the systematic focus of someone who had learned to find the spine of a document before reading the whole body of it. She found it 40 minutes in. It was a security footage file, attached to a communications chain about a case flagged for elevated handling. The case number matched one she had already identified in the flash drive files, a case that had been accelerated and closed with no final placement record. The footage was from a highway camera, date stamped 2 weeks ago. It showed a two-lane road outside the edge of small town, the kind of road that appeared on maps as a thin gray line with nothing notable nearby. At 11:47 p.m., a vehicle appeared moving slowly on the shoulder, a dark sedan, slightly crumpled on the driver's side, flashers on. And then, from the opposite direction, a second vehicle arrived, a black SUV with no visible license plate. The sedan's door opened. A woman got out. She was moving carefully but under her own power, unhurried, looking left and right once before walking toward the SUV. She was wearing a gray jacket and carrying nothing. She got into the SUV's rear passenger door, which had already opened from the inside. The SUV pulled away. 40 seconds later, emergency lights appear from the other direction, responding to what would be logged as a single vehicle accident with no occupants found at the scene. Evelyn stared at the screen. She slowed the footage to its lowest playback speed and moved through the frames one by one until she found a clear frame of the woman's face in the moment before she got into the SUV. She took a screenshot. She opened the files from the flash drive. She found the internal documents Danielle Brooks had signed as an auditor. There was a staff photo attached to her personnel record, standard issue, the kind of photo every institutional employee has. She put the two images side by side on her screen. The same woman, Danielle Brooks, had walked away from a staged accident scene and gotten into a government SUV at 11:47 p.m. 2 weeks ago. She had not died. She was somewhere. And the people who had arranged for her death certificate to be filed had also been the ones who told an 8-year-old girl that her mother was gone. Evelyn sat back in her chair and pressed both hands flat on her desk. The story was no longer just about money and political corruption and a pipeline of missing children. It was about a mother who had built an escape plan and a documentation trail, and had placed her daughter in the path of the one person she trusted to keep her safe, and had done all of this knowing she might be disappeared and that she needed the record to survive without her. She called her editor again. It was nearly midnight. He answered on the second ring. "I need more," she said, "but not for the current piece. For a second piece. I have security footage showing that Danielle Brooks is alive." It was a long pause. "Run it all," her editor said. At the county station, the night shift had slowed things down to the patient, institutional pace of a building in its quiet hours. Victor had returned from the hallway to find Amara unchanged, sitting in the same posture, hands at her lap, eyes steady, and had sat back down across from her with something different in his manner. Not softer exactly, but less directed. The specific purposefulness he'd carried all day had gone flat. He looked at the form on the table. He looked at her. "You're not going to sign it," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. He nodded slowly, more to himself than to her. She watched him. Something had changed in the hallway. She could tell from the way he had come back through the door, different weight in his step, different set to his expression. She filed it without speaking. "Your mother," Victor said, "was trying to do the right thing." Amara's hands tightened slightly in her lap, but she kept her face still. "I know. She risked a lot." He was quiet for a moment. "She's smarter than most of the people in this situation, including the ones who thought they were managing it." Amara looked at him steadily. "Is she okay?" Victor met her eyes. A long moment passed between them. He looked like a man measuring something for the last time before making a decision about its weight. "I believe so," he said. It was the first thing he had said to her all day that didn't feel like a prepared answer. She recognized the difference. Her mother had taught her the difference. The sound of a person saying what they actually thought versus the sound of a person saying what they needed you to believe. She didn't say anything, but something in her posture changed, the kind of change that was so small it was almost invisible, but that she couldn't fully control. A fraction of the tightness in her shoulders came down. Victor reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small folded slip of paper. He held it in front of him for a moment, looking at it, making some final internal calculation. Then he set it on the table and slid it toward the form, not touching it, but close. He didn't say what it was. "I have to make another call," he said. He stood up, gathered the unsigned form, and tucked it back into his folder. "I'll be back." He left. Amara looked at the slip of paper on the table. She reached out and opened it. It had an address written on it in small, precise handwriting. Below the address were the words, "Federal Property." And below that, in even smaller writing, "She was moved here when the case stalled." She read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it in the small inner pocket of her backpack, beside the spot where the flash drive had been. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Her mother was alive. She didn't know it with certainty. The slip of paper wasn't certainty, but it felt like it might be true in the particular way that some things feel true before you can prove them. She thought about Ryder down the hall. She thought about the way he had come across the compound room in 4 steps when she started gathering her bag. She thought about what he had said, not the words exactly, but the particular quality of them. The directness without decoration. The way he stated a thing and meant it. She had not, in her 8 years of careful observation, encountered many adults who said a thing and meant it without also meaning something else at the same time. Her mother was one. Ryder, she thought, might be another. She put her hand on her backpack and waited. In another part of the building, Senator Reeves' second call to Victor went unanswered. He tried 3 times over the next 20 minutes, pacing his office in the State House 40 miles away, while his communications director and chief of staff sat on the couch across from his desk with the careful stillness of people who had learned not to speak during these moments. The wall-mounted television was tuned to the local news. The cheer at the bottom of the screen was displaying a headline about financial irregularities in foster care funding. Reeves stared at it and said nothing. His communications director spoke first. "It doesn't name you." "Not yet," Reeves said. "The sourcing is thin. We can still." "Not yet means soon," Reeves said. He stopped pacing. He looked at the television with the expression of a man watching something he built beginning to come apart. "Find out where Hale is." His chief of staff was already on his phone. Across town, Evelyn was finishing the second article. This one had the name in it. This one had the financial charts and the communications log and the placement records and the security footage. This one was the piece she had been building toward for 2 days, without knowing 2 days ago that she was building toward it. She read it through once. She sent it to her editor. Then she opened a separate email, composed a careful and precise message to the Federal Inspector General's office for the state, and attached copies of every document she had. She pressed send at 12:47 in the morning. She drank the rest of her water switched the kettle on for coffee, and sat back to wait for morning. The morning of the custody hearing arrived cold and overcast, the kind of sky that pressed down low over the courthouse roof like it had something to say and hadn't decided how to say it yet. Evelyn had been awake since 5. By the time the sun came up, she had already received 2 responses. One from the Federal Inspector General's office acknowledging receipt of her evidence package and flagging it for immediate review, and one from her editor confirming the second article was live. The piece had been up for 40 minutes and had already been picked up by 3 national outlets. Her phone had not stopped moving since. She drove to the courthouse with her recorder, her notebook, and the copy of the security footage saved to her phone. She didn't know exactly what the morning would produce, but she had been in this business long enough to recognize the particular energy of a situation that had crossed the point of containment. Something was going to break today. It was just a matter of where. Outside the courthouse, Big Cal had done exactly what he said he would do. There were 43 bikes lined up along the street in a row that stretched half a block in each direction from the courthouse steps. The riders stood beside them, not aggressive, not loud, not blocking anything, just present. 43 large men in leather standing in the cold morning air with their arms at their sides, watching the courthouse entrance with the patient attention of people who had nowhere else to be. Several news vans had already positioned across the street. Cameras turned toward the bikes, then toward the courthouse doors, then back toward the bikes. The visual was not what anyone had prepared for when they thought about this hearing. Not the outlaw chaos a biker gang was supposed to represent, but something that looked much more like a community showing up in organized, deliberate solidarity. Big Cal stood at the front of the line with his arms crossed and said nothing to anyone. He didn't need to. Inside the courtroom, Ryder sat beside Patricia, where at the defense table, and looked straight ahead. He had slept 3 hours. He had been in this building since the previous morning, and he was aware, in the specific way that courtrooms made you aware of how small the room was relative to everything that had been building outside it. Senator Reeves was present. He had come in through a side entrance with 2 aides flanking him, wearing the kind of composed public expression that had been built over years of appearances and had not yet received information about how the morning was going to go. He took a seat in the gallery with the air of a man who had arranged to be witnessed being present. He had prepared remarks for the press pool about the importance of child safety and the disturbing intersection of organized crime and vulnerable youth. The hearing began at 9. Reeves' attorney made a formal statement about the guardianship documentation and the Amber Alert and the clear evidence of a biker with a violent record taking a child without authorization. The language was clean and well-prepared and moved efficiently through the narrative that Victor Hale had been constructing since the diner. Patricia stood when it was her turn. She challenged the authenticity of the guardianship documents on the grounds that the signatory, Danielle Brooks, was officially listed as deceased at the time of signing. She requested a full audit of the document's origin and the circumstances of its notarization. She submitted 3 pieces of supporting documentation: the date of Danielle's official death certificate, a timeline of Victor's contact with state authorities that predated the Amber Alert by 48 hours, and a forensic analysis doc had quietly produced overnight on the digital metadata of the guardianship forms, which showed the documents had been created 11 days after Danielle's listed date of death. The forgery was not sophisticated. It had been built for speed, not scrutiny. The judge, a methodical woman in her late 60s, named the Honorable Patricia Burns, studied the documentation for a long moment without expression. Then she looked at Reeves' attorney and asked, in a tone that was professionally neutral and somehow devastating, whether he wished to respond. Reeves' attorney asked for a recess. Before it could be granted, a door at the back of the courtroom opened, and Doc walked in. He had not been on the witness list. Patricia had filed an emergency edition at 7 that morning, and the judge had allowed it over Reeves' attorney's objection on the grounds that newly discovered evidence merited expedited presentation. Doc walked to the stand with the unhurried bearing of a man who had been in difficult situations before and understood that the way you moved through a room communicated something before you said a word. He testified for 12 minutes. He presented the timestamps showing that the flash drive files had been accessed and documented before Ryder ever made contact with Amara, meaning the evidence trail Danielle had built existed independently of anything Ryder had done. He walked through the metadata on the guardianship forms in plain language, without jargon, explaining what the timestamps indicated in terms that required no legal training to understand. He presented the file showing 47 incomplete placement cases. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He simply described what the data showed and let the room receive it. Halfway through the testimony, Reeves leaned over to his aide and said something quiet. The aide took out his phone. Reeves watched the stand with an expression that had begun to show the edges of what was underneath the composure. Not quite fear, but the rigid over-control of a man whose carefully maintained surface was being pressed from too many directions at once. At 10:22, Evelyn's security footage played on a screen that had been set up at the front of the courtroom. The room watched Danielle Brooks walk away from the staged accident and get into a government SUV. The room watched the timestamp. The room watched the door close behind her and the SUV pull away into the dark. The judge watched it once, then asked for it to be replayed. Courtroom murmurs had been building through the testimony, the careful, controlled kind that people try to suppress in formal settings and can't quite manage. Now they crested. The judge called for order, and the room quieted, but the quality of the quiet had changed. It was the quiet of a space where everyone was processing the same information simultaneously and arriving at the same place. Reeves' attorney was on his feet again, attempting a procedural objection about chain of custody for the footage. The judge heard him out and then, with the particular brevity of someone who had made a decision and was communicating it through economy of words, denied the objection. Outside, the national media cameras had found the story. Evelyn's second article was on every major outlet's homepage. The biker convoy photographs were circulating. The headline that had started with financial irregularities in foster care funding had become something considerably larger, and the photograph that led most of the coverage was not of the senator or the courthouse. It was of 43 bikes in a row on a cold street with 43 men standing beside them, which told a story that required no caption. At 10:51, federal agents arrived at the courthouse. They came from the Inspector General's office, 4 of them, with a sealed warrant and the specific quiet efficiency of people operating outside the political structures that Senator Reeves had spent a career cultivating. They moved through the building's side entrance with courthouse security escorting them and presented their documentation to the clerk outside the courtroom. Reeves saw them come through the door. His expression held for about 4 seconds. Then something in it shifted, not dramatically, not the collapse of a man who had given up. More like the specific stillness that falls over a person when they understand that the thing they have been maneuvering to prevent has arrived regardless, and the maneuvering is over. He stood up from the gallery. He said something brief to his aide and began moving toward the far side of the courtroom, toward the side exit that led to a service corridor. His steps were measured. He was still performing composure. He made it 12 feet. The federal agent nearest the exit stepped into the corridor entrance without hurry and stood there. Reeves stopped. The room was watching now, openly, without pretense, the way a room watches when it understands that something definitive is occurring. The judge had paused the proceedings. Patricia had her hand on Ryder's arm, a light, steadying touch. Reeves turned back to face the room. His communications director was already on his phone in the gallery, the call clearly not going well. Both aides had sat down. The composed public figure who had given speeches in church halls and community centers and talked about child protection with controlled emotion was standing in a courtroom with federal warrants being processed at the door, and the expression that was left when the performance ran out of road was something much smaller and more ordinary. Just a man who had made choices and was now standing inside their consequences. The hearing was formally suspended. Ryder was released pending the federal investigation's review of the guardianship documentation. He walked out of the courtroom into the hallway, and the first thing he did was look for Amara. Victor Hale was already in the federal agent's temporary office when Ryder found Amara in the building's family waiting area down the hall. She was sitting in a chair against the wall with her backpack on her lap, watching the corridor. When she saw him, something in her face did what it had done at the compound when he told her she didn't get to run alone. That small, barely visible shift. Like a knot releasing 1 degree. He sat down in the chair beside her. They were quiet for a moment. "Is it over?" she asked. "The main part," he said. "There's more to come. But the part where you had to sit in rooms signing things, that part's done." She nodded. She looked at her backpack. "I didn't sign anything." "I know," he said. She was quiet again. Then, "Is my mom alive?" He had been turning this question over in his mind for 2 days. He had been carrying the weight of what he knew and what he didn't know, and the distinction between official records and what a piece of security footage showed. He looked at her carefully. "I think so," he said. "There's footage. It shows her after the accident, getting into a car. She was moving on her own." Amara absorbed this with the particular stillness of a person receiving information they have been bracing for in 2 directions simultaneously. Both the good version and the bad version, held ready, and are only now finding out which one is real. "Where is she?" "We're working on that," he said. "Today." She looked at the wall across from them. Her hands on the backpack straps were loose. "Okay," she said. It was a small word, but the way she said it carried a kind of trust that was not naive. It was the trust of someone who had evaluated a person carefully and made a decision. Inside the federal agent's office, Victor was talking. He had made the decision the previous night in the hallway outside the room where Amara sat with the unsigned form. And once he made it, he didn't revise it. He understood the transaction, cooperation for immunity, his testimony for the framework of the investigation, and he entered into it without performance. He answered questions directly. He described the falsified guardianship documents, explained how they had been produced under Reeves' direction, and identified the contractor who had notarized them. He described the pressure tactics used on families in the placement network. He described the conversation with Reeves the previous afternoon, the directive to resolve the liability. He described what resolve had been implied to mean. He was in the room for 3 hours. When he came out, he looked older than he had going in the way that people sometimes look after they have set down something very heavy that they have been carrying for a long time. Not lighter exactly, but different. The federal agents who were not occupied with Victor had gone to the courthouse records office and then to the county communications system, pulling the files that backed up what Evelyn's documentation had already shown. Reeves was formally placed under arrest at 12:30 in the afternoon in the courthouse building he had walked into that morning intending to watch Ryder Cole be convicted. The charges as initially filed covered obstruction of justice, financial misconduct, and witness intimidation, with a broader investigation into the foster transfer network opening as a separate and considerably larger proceeding. His communications director issued a statement asserting his innocence. Nobody from his office was available for comment after that. The safe house was a federal facility 40 minutes outside the city on a flat, treeless stretch of road that looked like nothing from the outside. A low building behind a chain-link fence with 2 unmarked vehicles in the lot and a guard station at the entrance. Evelyn had gotten the address from the slip of paper Amara had given Ryder in the hallway. Ryder had called Patricia, who had called the federal agents, who had made contact with the marshal's service managing the facility. The confirmation came back within an hour. Danielle Brooks had entered protective custody 6 weeks earlier following an approach from investigators working outside Reeves' sphere of influence. She had been held in communication isolation when the case stalled under political pressure, unable to make outside contact, unaware of what was happening to her daughter, unaware that Reeves' people had attempted to reroute Amara. They drove out in the early afternoon, Ryder in his truck, Evelyn in her car, a federal escort in front. The sky had cleared by then, the low clouds moving east and leaving behind the pale, thin blue of a Midwestern winter afternoon. At the facility gate, a federal marshal reviewed their documentation and made a brief call inside. Then the gate opened. They walked through into a reception area, clean, institutional, the specific kind of plain that government buildings have when nobody has tried to make them anything else. A door at the far end of the room opened. Danielle Brooks came through it. She was thinner than in her personnel photo, and there were shadows under her eyes from weeks of the particular exhaustion that comes from being contained in a small space with a large amount of fear and very little information. She was wearing the plain clothes the facility had provided. She walked into the reception area and stopped. Amara was already moving. She didn't run the way children run in movies, arms out, voice raised, the full theatrical release of emotion. She crossed the room in quick, certain steps and pressed herself against her mother's side, and Danielle's arms came around her and held on, and they were both very quiet. No words at first, just the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have been separated by something terrible and have arrived back at each other. Ryder stood near the door with his hands loose at his sides and looked at the wall to give them the moment. Danielle looked up after a while. Her eyes found Ryder across the room. She studied him, his size, his vest, his face, the skull patch. She looked at it the way someone looks at a thing that has been part of a plan they made in a frightened hour, seeing it for the first time in reality rather than memory. "Marcus talked about you," she said. Her voice was steady, but carried the texture of everything she had been through. "He said you were the stubborn one, that you do the right thing even when it cost you." Ryder was quiet for a moment. "He was wrong about a lot of things," he said. "Wasn't wrong about that." Danielle's eyes moved to Amara and back. "She told you to look for the patch." "She did. She found you." She walked across a diner floor in front of a man she was scared to ask a stranger to pretend to be her father, he said. "She did the hard part." Amara, still pressed against her mother's side, looked over at him. "You did the hard part," she said. "We'll call it even," he said. Danielle tightened her arms around her daughter. She looked at Ryder with the expression of a woman who had spent 6 weeks in isolation with nothing but time to understand exactly what she had set in motion and what it had cost the people she had set it in motion toward. "I didn't have a better option," she said. It was an acknowledgement, not an apology. She was not a woman who wasted energy on apology when acknowledgement was the accurate thing. "I know," he said. "Neither did I." Victor Hale testified before a federal grand jury 6 weeks later. His testimony was thorough and specific, covering 3 years of Reeves' operation from the inside. The falsified guardianship documents were formally voided. The 47 incomplete placement cases were opened for individual investigation, with a federal child welfare task force assigned to locate and account for each child. The Bright Futures Placement Group was dissolved, its assets frozen pending full audit. Reeves was convicted on 7 counts. The sentencing hearing was attended by representatives from 14 families whose cases had passed through the placement network. He received 12 years. Ryder was formally cleared. A federal oversight commendation was offered, acknowledging his role in preventing an unlawful transfer and preserving the flash drive evidence chain. He declined the commendation. He showed up to the federal building, shook the hand of the agent who offered it, said he'd rather not have his name in any official document if it was all the same to them, and drove home. Danielle regained legal custody of Amara without contest. She spent the weeks following the investigation in a temporary apartment while her case was processed, and during those weeks Ryder found himself making the 40-minute drive more often than he had expected. The first time, he told himself it was to check on things. The second time, he brought food because the apartment complex was far from the nearest decent grocery store. By the fourth time, he had stopped providing himself explanations. Amara opened the door when he knocked and told him he was late, that they'd already started dinner, and stepped aside to let him in with the matter-of-fact ease of someone receiving a person who was expected. Danielle looked up from the kitchen with an expression that was the closest thing she allowed herself to teasing. "She set a place for you," Danielle said. He looked at the table. There was a plate. He sat down. He did not know, then, what to call what was being built. He wasn't sure it needed a name. Some things were better approached the way Amara had approached that diner floor, one step at a time, purposefully, without waiting for certainty. Months later, on a Tuesday morning in late spring, he stood in the parking lot of Amara's school with a group of parents he didn't know, waiting for the spring assembly to end. He was still wearing leather. He hadn't changed that and didn't plan to. But the hostility that had always lived just below the surface of how he moved through spaces like this, the reflexive readiness for someone to have a problem with him, was quieter now. Not gone, but quieter. One of the other parents, a man in a fleece vest holding a coffee cup, made brief eye contact and nodded. Ryder nodded back. The school doors opened and children came streaming out into the spring light, carrying artwork and folders and the barely contained energy of a morning almost done. Amara came through the doors with a piece of construction paper in one hand and found him in the crowd the same way she had found him in the diner. Directly, without hesitation, as if she had known exactly where to look. She walked over to him and held up the construction paper. It was a drawing, the kind of drawing that was very clearly a child's work, but had the focused quality of something made with specific intention. A large figure in a dark vest with a beard. A small figure beside it in a pink coat. Outside what appeared to be a building with a checkered floor. "That's from the beginning," she said. He looked at it for a moment. "I can tell." She fell in a step beside him as they walked toward the truck. "You know you're not pretending anymore, right?" she said. He had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for that question. He had been carrying the answer to it for months, checking it periodically the way you check something to make sure it's still true. "No, kid," he said. "I'm not pretending anymore." She seemed satisfied with that in the specific way. She was satisfied by things that confirmed what she had already worked out for herself. She got in the truck and buckled her seatbelt and looked out the window at the spring trees going by. He started the engine. Behind them, a diner passed on the right side of the road. Red vinyl booths visible through the fog glass. The ordinary warmth of a place that was just a place to most people and was something else entirely to them. He didn't point it out. He didn't need to. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and stay close because the next one might just change the way you see people you'd normally walk right past.